Well, Theo Usherwood is a political commentator. Theo, great to see you in the studio. How are you doing?
Very great to be with you. Very well.
And we're also talking today about the nicest place to live in the UK. And I understand you've just come back from there. Your friend lives there.
Should we keep it a secret in case any of your listeners haven't heard which is the nicest place to live in the UK? I can vouch that it is absolutely beautiful. I went to see a friend there who's just moved out, left London during the pandemic, and I went to visit him and his family out there, and it is absolutely stunning.
What's it called?
Woodbridge.
Woodbridge.
And it's in Suffolk, and it's on the estuary, and I'll need to look it up in a moment. It's on a river estuary, and it's swallows in Amazon's territory.
I would imagine the house prices in Woodbridge have just soared like those swallows and those Amazons as a result of what Theo has just said there, and indeed it being named the nicest part of Britain to live in. Let's talk about Keir Starmer. He's been talking about the early release scheme. This is what he has had to say.
Well, I am critical of the Tories' early release scheme because what's happened is that they're releasing early prisoners who should still be in prison.
Well, that's Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister there. Now, fewer criminals are going to be sent to combat a 12,000 cell shortfall, and we know that the number of people being sent to prison is to be reduced. This damning report laying bare the extent of overcrowding. Theo, take us through this.
So this is a report from the National Audit Office, which has oversight of various different departments in government, and it's come to the conclusion that by 2027, even with the extra prison spaces that are going to be built and put in place, that we're actually going to be brought on stream originally by the Tories, and of course there's a general election, that actually still the deficit is going to be 12,000. There's going to be a shortage of 12,000 places. Now, Labour has said as a response to that, and it's come out today, it was on the front page of the Times, that what they're going to do is they're going to introduce new measures which will mean that more convicts, those convicted of crimes, serve their sentences under house arrest, effectively, that they're given tags or other measures so they can avoid going to prison. But we're still probably going to be talking about people convicted of serious offences, things like...
Because there were people who were let out of prison relatively recently for some quite serious things as well.
Domestic abuse.
Yeah, well, that was the big controversy as well, because they said violent offenders won't be let out. Well, domestic abuse is it's often violent, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's actually coercive control or things that would really make you worry about that person being out on the streets.
This has been in the pipeline for some time, and you heard the sort of noises off from people connected with prisons who were saying that something needed to be done away from prisons in order to deal with offenders, because clearly there was going to be a crisis. People like the Chief Inspector of Prisons were saying, it just simply wasn't going to be possible to build the prison places in time. It's something like £600,000 just to build one prison cell, if you take into account the cost of a full prison.
Yes.
And so they were going to have to look at other measures, and clearly that can't be, other measures that are quicker and easier to introduce. But I was speaking to a leading barrister about this just a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying, of course, it's all very well putting somebody on tag, but what is the incentive for them to stay on tag and abide by their conditions? Because at the moment, if you're on licence, if you're released under licence to serve your second half of your prison sentence at home and you have an electronic tag, then the incentive for you to do as your probation officer sets out that you must do, attend the meetings that you must do, is that if you break the terms of those conditions, you go to prison.
Yes.
Now, what happens, this is a question the government haven't answered on this, what happens, you sentence somebody to 6 months on an electronic tag rather than sending them to prison. But are you saying that what's the incentive for them to abide by the conditions of that sentence?
Well, exactly.
Because if they don't adhere to the sentence, and you're not prepared to send them to prison because prisons are overcrowded, then why should they bother? Because there's no incentive.
There's also the probation service itself, which is having massively overstretched, as you say. There are far more people who are out that they have to monitor, and it only takes one of these people. And we know that many of these people have broken the law. We know that some of them have had to go back to prison, but actually the probation office gets it in the neck when actually they're trying to do presumably the best job they can do within this. So that's a very, very difficult thing as well.
And nobody wants to be the probation officer who overlooks sending somebody back to prison, and then that individual, having broken the terms of their licence, then goes on and commits a really serious offence, and it gets to sentencing for that really serious offence, and the judge turns around and goes, well, why was he still out on licence when he'd breached the terms of his condition, and could it have been this crime, this really serious crime with serious impacts on the victim, could have been prevented if the actual probation officer had done their job. So they're always going to err on the side of caution, probation officers. They're super cautious because they don't want it boomeranging back to them. They didn't send somebody to prison when they broke the terms of their licence. So it's very difficult to see how this grand plan within the government in real terms is actually, when you get down to brass tacks, is actually going to work. If you can't, if the probation service can't turn around and say, if you break the terms of your licence, you're given a house arrest, but if you break the terms of your licence, you're going straight to prison. And I just don't, I personally, and this is having had conversations, prison service and barristers, criminal barristers alike, I can't see it working necessarily.
Let's have a difficult conversation about the 20,000 cells. Now, I was in government when this was pledged. I was a special advisor in the Ministry of Justice, only for 6 months, but nonetheless it was pledged under Boris Johnson. And the idea was that 20,000 cells or 20,000 prison places would be, they were certainly announced, and they would be put out there, they would be built. But the National Audit Office now say it would take until 2031, so over 10 years late, to complete the existing prison expansion programme of 20,000 cells, 5 years later than originally planned. Well, actually 10 years after it was originally announced, but 5 years later than it was meant to be completed. 4.2 billion over budget. Only 6,518 of the extra places pledged by the Ministry of Justice in 2021 have actually been delivered so far. It was unrealistic, it was over-ambitious.
I mean, it's a disaster. I mean, you've got to, you can only, Boris, in fairness to Boris Johnson, he's set out, he's the Prime Minister, he can't be responsible, previous Prime Minister, for every small commission that, every small building programme.
This is a big one.
But this is a big one, and he should have, they needed to deliver it. And the civil servants and the team within the Ministry of Justice and the contractor, whoever has been contracted in this particular case, needed to deliver it. It's absolutely critical.
But this is always the way with government procurement, when the government builds things. And the point is that Labour now, I mean, look, I'm taking nothing away from the fact that that was a failure of the Conservatives. There's no doubt about it. I was involved a tiny bit within it. So therefore, I take responsibility for that. The Conservatives need to take responsibility for that. Boris Johnson needs to take responsibility for it. But also the Ministry of Justice and the civil servants need to take responsibility as well. Because we're in a situation where this was meant to happen, it hasn't happened, and now we have a shortfall of nearly half those prison places, which had they been built, there wouldn't be a shortfall of 12,500 prison places. That is a fact.
And it sounds, Peter, it sounds like quite a boring story, doesn't it? Prison places needing to be built, contractor can't deliver it on time, and it's sort of, it's a story. Initially you might think, oh, well, it's just a story about, poor administration and poor accounting within the Ministry of Department of Civil Service and the contractor and who's responsible. But actually this story has real-world impacts on the fact that people who are convicted of serious offences cannot be kept away from those people who they're victims, whether they be women, single women with children, whether they be people who've abused other people or committed serious crimes. They need to be off the streets. And the prison service, you could say, well, it's just an accounting story and it's about, whether it's civil servants to blame. But actually, for many of your listeners out there, they will be wanting to know that the government of any colour, whether it's the Conservative government or this new Labour government, can keep them safe. And they can keep, and that there is the option there for judges to send people to prison, and not just necessarily for 20 years for committing a murder, but also for short, sharp prison sentences, and it acts as a deterrent that you are going to go to prison if you commit a crime that might not be the very top end of the scale in terms of the seriousness of the offence, but that deterrent still exists, and the whole system doesn't work if those people who commit crimes are out there in the community and they know there's very little chance of them actually being deprived of their liberty should they commit what they might seem as not necessarily being the most serious offence, but certainly for the victim is a very impactful event.
I want to talk to you in just a second about Louise Haigh, because she was mentioned at Prime Minister's Questions today. Speaking of people with criminal convictions, the former Transport Secretary. We're going to play that clip in just a second. But first of all, let me just read out a couple of messages that have come in. Jazz says, deportation of illegals, etc., who are in prison, that's the answer. Gareth says, one of the conditions in the tag, when you have a tag, when you're let out of prison and you have a tag, is the need for accommodation, which a lot don't have, and that is why they need prison. I've known plans that took this into account and recalled on a Monday when they were released on a Friday. And actually, back to my time at the Ministry of Justice, one of the things we did try to do and piloted a scheme was saying, if you let people out on a Friday, they've nowhere to go. They've nowhere to go. And the drug dealers are literally standing there at the prison gate saying, do a job for me, I'll give you a bed for the night. And the fact is that you do need to have accommodation for people, but there's so many people who haven't committed a crime who don't have anywhere to live either, and it's not fair.
I've heard a story of an individual being released from prison. They were just given a travel warrant back to their home in Boston, in Lincolnshire, and nothing else. What do you expect to happen?
Yes.
If they have nowhere to stay, they have no money in their back pocket, all they've got is a trade.
But then there are plenty of people who don't have money in their back pocket and don't have somewhere to stay here. They're saying, well, I haven't broken the law. What about me? It's a very, very difficult argument. Let's talk a little bit about Prime Minister's questions. About an hour ago, I covered this with Julie Hartley-Brewer. About an hour ago, Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, asked about Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary. She resigned on Friday. This is what Kemi Badenoch said and what Keir Starmer answered just about an hour ago.
The truth is, he appointed a person convicted of fraud to the cabinet. The first thing she did was bung hundreds of millions of pounds in pay rises to her trade union friends. Wasn't this a fraud on the British people? The country needs conviction politicians, not politicians with convictions.
Mr. Speaker, I gently remind her that 2 of her predecessors had convictions for breaking the COVID rules.
Well, there we are. Quite a good response there from Keir Starmer, but it does raise the issue of Louise Haigh yet again. She asked a couple of times on that, why was someone with a conviction for fraud be in the cabinet of this country?
And Keir Starmer didn't actually answer the question. He just simply said that new information came to light.
But he wouldn't tell us what it was.
He wouldn't tell us what it was. So the Louise Haigh aside, like, she
is it
shouldn't have been in the
Haigh or
cabinet.
Haigh?
Haigh. I understood it was Haigh. You say Haigh.
I'll say
Should we agree?
William Haigh.
Haigh, yeah, but I'm happy to...
I think it's Haigh. I'm not saying you're wrong. It's just I thought it was Haigh. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
I'll say Haigh. Apologies.
No, don't apologise. You're probably right.
So, this goes to Keir Starmer's judgment, right? Now, his argument, and the argument at the time, I guess, was, well, she deserved a second chance. This was a spent conviction. It was all a misunderstanding. And she made the full declaration. She said the full declaration when she joined his shadow cabinet back in 2020. And that was enough to see her take quite a senior position within his cabinet in July when she became the Transport Secretary. But what he hasn't said is what's changed that meant she now had to resign. What new information has come to light? There's something about the scale of the apparent alleged allegations against her, that it actually wasn't just about one mobile phone and one incident, one conviction, that there were other incidents when she was a policy manager at Aviva. But Keir Starmer hasn't said, and it's that which is really important. I think that's why Kemi Badenoch, actually, to be fair to her, it was a fair question to ask, and
yes.
Keir Starmer didn't answer it. And I think people do have a right to know. I mean, his other retort in one of the answers to the other questions, well, it was a private conversation. You're talking about your decision to appoint somebody to the cabinet who then goes and does a deal with the rail unions to the tune of billions of pounds. I mean, public sector right across the board.
That's right.
£10 billion to pay. They got the rail unions got a 14% pay rise with no conditions over 3 years, with no conditions with no conditions to actually reform to get. They still use fax machines because that's apparently the way they do it. So, you know, what on earth, you know, and this has all just been signed off. And I think actually we were talking about this when it broke last Friday, Peter, but you know, I think there's also what Keir Starmer perhaps doesn't want to admit is that he left Louise Haigh to go off and do a deal with the trade unions on this. But actually, she's not done a very good deal, and they need, you know, the Treasury and Rachel Reeves and the Chancellor and Keir Starmer need a much more oversight over that department, particularly when it comes to doing deals with the rail unions, because it was clearly the tail that was wagging the dog during those negotiations.
OK, Theo, thank you.